Sometimes the most ordinary days become extraordinary in ways we never expect. Sometimes a simple ride across familiar land leads to discoveries that challenge everything we think we know about luck, fate, and the mysterious ways life works. This is the true story of how one man's routine morning became a miracle that would transform not just his life, but the lives of two innocent children who had been forgotten by the world. What started as checking cattle fences in the remote corners of a Texas ranch turned into something that newspapers would call impossible, that scientists couldn't explain, and that would make believers out of the most stubborn skeptics. This is about more than rescue and adoption. This is about the kind of blessing that makes you question whether some things in this world happen for reasons beyond our understanding. The man who found them was as practical as they come. He didn't believe in luck, fate, or miracles. He believed in hard work, common sense, and taking care of what was his. But what he discovered on that dusty morning would shape those beliefs to their core and prove that sometimes the most incredible stories are the ones that actually happen. This is that story. Thomas Mitchell had been working the same stretch of Texas ranch land for 37 years. Every morning started the same way. Black coffee at 5. He was a man of routine, and that routine had served him well through decades of drought, storms, and all the challenges that came with raising livestock on 1,500 acres of stubborn Texas soil. The morning of September 23rd started no different than any other. The sky was clear, promising another hot day, and Thomas loaded his truck with fence repair tools and water bottles. The eastern pasture needed checking after the storm 2 nights before, and he wanted to make sure none of the cattle had wandered off through any broken fencing. As he drove the familiar dirt road that cut through his property, Thomas noticed something odd near the old abandoned well, about 2 miles from his house. There was a small blue tarp fluttering in the morning breeze, caught on some mesquite bushes. He'd been past this spot hundreds of times, and that tarp had never been there before. His first thought was that some of the storm debris had blown in from somewhere else. Thomas parked his truck and walked over to untangle the tarp from the thorny branches. As he got closer, he realized it wasn't just caught on the bushes. It was deliberately stretched between them, creating a small shelter. Someone had been camping here, on his land, and recently. He was about to call out, thinking maybe some homeless person had set up camp, when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was crying, not the crying of an adult, but the unmistakable sound of children in distress. Moving carefully around the makeshift shelter, Thomas discovered 2 small children huddled together under the blue tarp. A girl who looked to be about 8 years old was holding a boy who couldn't have been more than 5. Both were dirty, clearly hungry, and wearing clothes that had seen better days weeks ago. The girl looked up at him with eyes that held fear and exhaustion, but also a fierce protectiveness over the smaller boy. "Please don't hurt us," she whispered, pulling her little brother closer. "We didn't mean to be on your land. We'll leave." Thomas knelt down slowly, his mind racing. How had these children ended up here? Where were their parents? How long had they been living under this tarp in the middle of nowhere? "Hey there," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Thomas. What are your names?" The girl hesitated for a long moment before answering. "I'm Sarah, and this is my brother Danny. Are you going to call the police?" The fear in her voice broke something in Thomas's chest. These weren't troublemakers or runaways looking for adventure. These were scared, hungry children who had somehow ended up abandoned in the most desolate part of his ranch. "How long have you been here?" Thomas asked gently. 3 days, I think, Sarah said. "Maybe 4. It's hard to tell." Thomas looked around the small camp. There were a few empty water bottles, some crackers wrapper, and what looked like the remains of a small fire that had been carefully extinguished. Someone had taught this girl well about fire safety, even in their desperate situation. "Where are your parents, sweetheart?" Sarah's face crumpled, and she started crying for the first time since he'd found them. "They left us," she sobbed. "Mama's boyfriend said we were too much trouble. He drove us out here and told us to wait, that someone would come get us. But nobody came." The rage that filled Thomas in that moment was unlike anything he'd ever felt. Someone had deliberately abandoned these children in the middle of nowhere, left them to die in the elements. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. The nearest town was 15 miles. Without water, these kids wouldn't have lasted much longer. "Well, somebody did come get you," Thomas said firmly. "You're safe now. Let's get you out of this heat." He helped the children gather their few belongings and walked them to his truck. Danny hadn't said a word yet, just clung to his sister and stared at Thomas with huge, solemn eyes. Sarah moved like someone much older than her. 8 years carefully checking to make sure they hadn't forgotten anything before leaving their makeshift camp. As they drove back to his house, Thomas tried to process what had just happened. He lived alone and had never had children of his own. His wife had died 7 years earlier from cancer, and they'd never been able to have kids. Now, suddenly, he had 2 frightened children depending on him. "Are you hungry?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied politely. "But we don't have any money to pay you." "Nobody's talking about money," Thomas said. "When's the last time you ate?" "Yesterday morning we finished the crackers," Sarah said. "But Danny's been drinking water, so he's okay." Thomas's hands tightened on the steering wheel. These children had been surviving on crackers and water for days, left to die by adults who should have protected them. The miracle wasn't that he'd found them. The miracle was that they were still alive. When they reached his house, Thomas led them to his kitchen and started pulling food from the refrigerator. He made them sit at his kitchen table while he prepared sandwiches, and he noticed how their eyes followed his every movement, like they were afraid the food might disappear. "Eat slow," he told them as he set the plates down. "Your stomachs need to get used to food again." While they ate, Thomas called his neighbor, Maria Santos, who lived on the adjoining ranch with her husband. Maria had raised 4 children of her own and had always been the person people called when they needed help with kids. "Maria, I need you to come over," Thomas said when she answered. "I found 2 children on my property. They've been abandoned." "What?" "Thomas, are you serious?" "Dead serious. They're sitting in my kitchen right now, eating sandwiches. I don't know what to do." "I'll be right there," Maria said without hesitation. "Don't call anyone else yet. Let me see them first." While they waited for Maria, Thomas sat with the children and tried to learn more about their situation. Sarah was clearly the protector and spokesman for both of them. Danny still hadn't spoken, but he stayed close to his sister and occasionally smiled when Thomas made a joke. "Can you tell me about your mama?" Thomas asked gently. "She works at the diner in town," Sarah said. "At least she used to. She met Rick about 6 months ago, and he moved in with us. He didn't like us very much. He said we were loud and cost too much money." "What about your daddy?" "Don't know him," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "Mama said he left before Danny was born." Thomas felt his heart breaking for these children. They'd been failed by every adult in their lives, abandoned by people who should have loved and protected them. When Maria arrived 20 minutes later, she took one look at the children and immediately went into mother mode. She sat with them, asked gentle questions, and somehow got Danny to speak his first words. He told her he liked her earrings. "Thomas," Maria said quietly, pulling him aside. "These children need immediate medical attention. They're dehydrated and malnourished. And we need to call child services." "I know," Thomas said. "But what happens then? They go into the system? Get split up, maybe?" "Maybe. But Thomas, you can't just keep them. There are legal procedures." Thomas looked back at Sarah and Danny, now sitting closer together on his couch, sharing a blanket Maria had wrapped around them. Sarah was reading a book she'd found on his coffee table to her little brother, her voice soft and patient. "What if I wanted to keep them?" Thomas heard himself ask. Maria's eyebrows shot up. "Thomas, you've never even talked about wanting children." "I never found children who needed me before," Thomas said simply. That afternoon, they took Sarah and Danny to the hospital in town. The doctors confirmed what Maria had suspected. Both children were dehydrated and underweight, but otherwise healthy. More remarkably, given their circumstances, neither child showed signs of serious illness or injury. The doctors called it fortunate that they'd been found when they were. While the children were being examined, Thomas spoke with a social worker named Janet Coleman, who had been called to the hospital. She was a kind woman in her 50s who had seen too many cases like this. The good news is that both children appear to be resilient and well cared for by each other," Janet said. "Sarah has clearly been taking excellent care of her little brother. The bad news is that we need to find their mother and this Rick person, and in the meantime the children will need to be placed in foster care." "What if I wanted to be their foster parent?" Thomas asked. Janet studied him carefully. "Mr. Mitchell, have you ever been a foster parent before?" "No, ma'am." "Do you have any experience with children?" "No, ma'am." "Why do you want to do this?" Thomas thought about that question for a long moment. "Because they need someone, and I found them." Seems like that might mean something. Janet made notes in her file. "It's not that simple, Mr. Mitchell. There are background checks, home inspections, training requirements. The process takes weeks, sometimes months. So what happens to them while all that's going on?" "They go to temporary foster care. We have some good families in the system." Thomas looked through the hospital room window at Sarah and Danny. Sarah was holding her brother's hand while a nurse checked his blood pressure, and she was singing softly to keep him calm. "They shouldn't be separated. Thomas said. "They've been through enough." "I agree," Janet said, "and we'll do our best to place them together." "But Mr. Mitchell, I have to be honest. Sibling groups are harder to place than individual children. There aren't as many families willing to take 2 kids at once." That evening, back at his ranch, Thomas sat on his porch and thought about the strangest day of his life. Maria had taken Sarah and Danny to her house for the night while the paperwork got sorted out. The children would be placed with a temporary foster family the next day while the investigation into their abandonment continued, and while Thomas went through the approval process to become their foster parent. But as Thomas sat there in the growing darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that finding these children wasn't just a coincidence. He'd been checking that eastern pasture for 37 years, and he'd never once stopped to investigate the old well area. Something had made him notice that blue tarp. Something had led him to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. He wasn't a religious man, hadn't been to church since his wife's funeral, but he couldn't help wondering if there wasn't something bigger at work here. 2 children, abandoned and left to die, somehow surviving long enough for him to find them. And him, a man who'd given up on the idea of family, suddenly wanting nothing more than to give these kids a home. As he went inside to prepare the spare bedrooms, just in case the social worker could work some magic, Thomas Mitchell had no idea that the blessing he couldn't explain yet was just beginning to reveal itself. The discovery of Sarah and Danny was only the first part of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about luck, miracles, and the mysterious ways that life sometimes works out exactly as it should. The investigation into Sarah and Danny's abandonment began the next morning with a visit from Detective Ray Hernandez of the County Sheriff's Department. Thomas had expected this. Abandoning children was a serious crime, and law enforcement needed to find the people responsible. Detective Hernandez was a patient man with a gentle way of talking to children that came from years of experience with difficult cases. He sat with Sarah and Danny in Maria's living room, letting them tell their story in their own words, while Thomas and Maria listened from the kitchen. "Can you tell me about the day you came to be on Mr. Mitchell's ranch?" Detective Hernandez asked Sarah. "It was 3 days ago, I think," Sarah said, counting on her fingers. "Rick told us we were going for a drive. Mama wasn't home. She was working the night shift at the diner. Rick said it would be fun, like an adventure." "What happened during this drive?" "We drove for a long time. Danny fell asleep. When we stopped, Rick gave us a backpack with some crackers and water bottles. He said we were going camping, but there wasn't a tent or anything." Thomas felt his jaw clench as he listened to the story unfold. The calculated cruelty of it made his stomach turn. "Did Rick say anything else?" Detective Hernandez asked. "He said someone would come get us soon. He said we should wait right there and not wander around. He said if we were good and waited quietly, everything would be okay." Danny, who had been silent during most of the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "He said Mama would come get us, but she didn't come." Detective made careful notes. "Did Rick ever hurt you or threaten you?"
"Not really," Sarah said.
"He just didn't like us. He was always telling Mama that we were too expensive and too loud. He said life would be better without us around." Through careful questioning, Detective Hernandez pieced together a clearer picture of what had happened. Rick Paulson had been dating the children's mother, Linda Hayes, for about 6 months. Neighbors reported frequent arguments between Rick and Linda about the children. Linda worked double shifts at an all-night diner to make ends meet, often leaving the children in Rick's care. The mother had no knowledge of what happened, Detective Hernandez told Thomas later that afternoon. She came home from work that morning to find Rick and the children gone. She thought he'd taken them to the park, or maybe to get breakfast. When they didn't come back by afternoon, she started calling his phone. He'd turned it off. "Where is she now?" "We found her yesterday evening. She'd been driving around town looking for them, had called everyone she could think of. She filed a missing persons report when she realized Rick had also taken all his belongings from her apartment." Thomas absorbed this information. "So she didn't know what he was planning?" "Doesn't appear so. She's devastated. Wants to see the children immediately." But when Linda Hayes arrived at the hospital that evening to reunite with Sarah and Danny, the meeting didn't go as anyone expected. The children were polite but distant with their mother. They answered her questions in short sentences and didn't run to hug her the way children usually did after a traumatic separation. Thomas watched the interaction from the hallway, and something about it bothered him. Linda seemed genuinely upset and relieved to see her children, but there was also something else in her manner. A kind of exhaustion, like she was already overwhelmed by having them back. "I don't know how I'm going to manage," Linda told Janet Coleman, the social worker. "I work 60 hours a week just to pay rent. I can't afford daycare for Danny, and I can't keep missing work every time something happens at school with Sarah." Janet nodded sympathetically. We have programs that can help with childcare costs and other support services. But what if something like this happens again? Linda asked. What if I meet someone else who doesn't want kids around? I can't watch them every second. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach as he listened to this conversation. This wasn't a mother fighting to get her children back. This was a mother trying to figure out what to do with children she couldn't handle. That night, Maria came to sit with Thomas on his porch. They'd both been quiet during dinner, processing everything that had happened over the past 2 days. That woman doesn't want those children back, Maria said bluntly. I was thinking the same thing, Thomas admitted. Did you see how Sarah acted around her? Like she was being careful not to say the wrong thing? Those children have been taking care of themselves for a long time, Maria said. Way before Rick ever came into the picture. What happens now? I don't know. The law says children should be with their natural parents whenever possible. But sometimes the law doesn't know what's best. The next morning brought a development that surprised everyone. Linda Hayes called Janet Coleman and asked for a meeting. When Janet arrived at Linda's small apartment, Linda was sitting at her kitchen table with papers spread out in front of her. I want to talk about giving up my parental rights, Linda said without preamble. Janet had been a social worker for 15 years and she'd had this conversation many times before. Usually it came after months or years of struggle, after multiple attempts to make things work. But Linda had reached this conclusion in less than 24 hours. Linda, this is a big decision, Janet said carefully. Are you sure you've thought it through? I've been thinking about it for months, Linda replied. Even before Rick. I love my kids, but I'm not a good mother. I work all the time, I'm always tired, and I don't know how to take care of them the way they need to be taken care of. Linda pulled out a piece of paper covered in her handwriting. I made a list, she said. All the times in the past year when something bad happened to Sarah and Danny because I wasn't paying attention or because I was too tired to be a real mom. Janet looked at the list. It was longer than she expected. Times when Sarah had to take Danny to school because Linda overslept after working a double shift. Times when the children went to bed hungry because Linda forgot to go grocery shopping. Times when Danny got sick at daycare and no one could reach Linda because she was at work and her phone was broken. The thing is, Linda continued, when I got home and found them gone, for just a minute, before I realized something was wrong, I felt relieved. What kind of mother feels relieved when her children disappear? Janet had heard this kind of honesty before from overwhelmed parents, and she never judged them for it. Some people weren't meant to be parents, and admitting it took a kind of courage that not everyone had. Have you thought about what you want to happen to Sarah and Danny? That man who found them, Linda said. Mr. J. Mitchell, I want them to go to him. Linda, it doesn't work that way. If you give up your rights, the children become wards of the state. They go into foster care, and eventually they're placed for adoption through the proper channels. But he wants them, right? I can tell he does. And they like him. Sarah told me he made them sandwiches and let them sleep in real beds. Janet made notes as Linda talked. Even if Mr. Mitchell does want to adopt them, there's a process. Background checks, home studies, waiting periods. It could take months. Then I won't give up my rights yet, Linda said firmly. I'll sign whatever papers you need to let him be their foster parent while all that gets worked out. But I want them with him, not in some stranger's house. This conversation led to another meeting, this time with Thomas, Linda, Janet, and Detective Hernandez. Linda's proposal was unusual but not unheard of. She wanted to voluntarily place her children in foster care with a specific family while maintaining her parental rights temporarily, with the understanding that she would eventually terminate those rights to allow for adoption. Why Mr. Mitchell specifically? Detective Hernandez asked. Linda looked at Thomas across the conference room table. Because he found them when nobody else could. Because he didn't have to care about what happened to them, but he did anyway. Because when I saw Sarah talking about him, it was the first time in months I've seen her smile. Thomas felt the weight of everyone's attention on him. I know this is all happening fast, he said. And I know I don't have any experience raising kids, but I want to try. I've got a big house. I work for myself so I can be around when they need me, and I've got savings put aside. Maybe most importantly, I want them to know that somebody chose them on purpose. Janet looked through her files. There are still procedures to follow. Home inspection, background check, references. But given the unusual circumstances and Linda's cooperation, we might be able to expedite things. How long? Thomas asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if everything checks out. And in the meantime, the children stay in temporary foster care.
I know a family that specializes in short-term placements for sibling groups.
Thomas looked at Linda. Despite everything that had happened, she clearly loved her children. She was just exhausted and honest enough to admit she couldn't give them what they needed. Ms. Hayes, Thomas said, if this works out, if I'm able to adopt Sarah and Danny, I want you to know they'll always know they had a mama who loved them enough to find them a better life. And if you want to stay in touch, write letters or send birthday cards, that would be okay with me. Linda started crying then, and Thomas realized this was the first time anyone had told her she wasn't a terrible person for wanting what was best for her children, instead of what was expected of her. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas's life changed completely. His house was inspected from top to bottom. Maria helped him childproof rooms and buy furniture appropriate for an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. He met with Janet Coleman 3 times to discuss everything from discipline strategies to educational planning. The background check revealed what everyone expected. Thomas Mitchell was exactly who he appeared to be. No criminal record, stable employment, good reputation in the community. His references, including his pastor, his veterinarian, and his bank manager, all described him as honest, reliable, and kind. But the most important part of the evaluation was watching Thomas interact with Sarah and Danny during supervised visits. Janet observed him carefully as he helped Danny with a puzzle, listened patiently to Sarah read from her favorite book, and answered their endless questions about ranch life. He's a natural, Janet noted in her report. The children are clearly comfortable with him, and he shows age-appropriate expectations and genuine affection. Detective Hernandez, meanwhile, had located Rick Paulson in another state. Rick had been arrested on unrelated charges, and, when confronted about the children, claimed he'd left them at a church and assumed someone would take care of them. The lie was easily disproven by the evidence, and Rick was charged with child abandonment and endangerment. He'll serve time, Detective Hernandez told Thomas. Probably 2 to 3 years. The judge wasn't sympathetic to someone who abandoned children in the middle of nowhere. 2 weeks and 3 days after finding Sarah and Danny under that blue tarp, Thomas Mitchell became their official foster parent. Janet Coleman drove them to his ranch on a sunny October morning, their few belongings packed in a single suitcase. As they pulled into the driveway, Sarah pressed her face to the window and pointed excitedly at the horses in the pasture. Danny had been asking about the cows for days, ever since Thomas told him he could help feed them. "Is this really going to be our house?" Sarah asked as they got out of the car. "For as long as you want it to be," Thomas said, and he meant it. But as Janet Coleman drove away that afternoon, leaving Thomas alone with 2 children for the first time in his life, he had no idea that the real blessing was still revealing itself. The challenges ahead would test everything he thought he knew about being a family, but they would also prove that sometimes the most important things in life come to us exactly when we're ready to receive them, even if we don't know we're ready yet. The first month of having Sarah and Danny in his home taught Thomas Mitchell that everything he thought he knew about his own life had been incomplete. He'd been living in a quiet, orderly world where he controlled his schedule, ate meals when he wanted them, and never had to negotiate with anyone about bedtimes or cartoons or whether vegetables were actually necessary at every meal. Now his house was full of voices, laughter, questions, and the kind of chaos that comes with children who are slowly learning to trust that they're safe. Sarah woke up every morning and immediately checked to make sure Danny was still in his bed. Danny refused to sleep without a light on in the hallway. Both children asked permission for everything from getting a drink of water to going to the bathroom. "They're waiting for you to change your mind," Maria Santos explained during one of her frequent visits. "Children who've been abandoned don't trust easily, even when they want to." Thomas was learning this truth in dozens of small ways. Sarah would ask if she could have a snack, and when he said yes, she'd take the smallest possible portion and save half for later. Danny played with his new toys like they might be taken away at any moment. Both children went to bed exactly when told and never asked for anything extra. "You can ask for things," Thomas told them one evening after dinner. "If you want a story before bed, or if you want to stay up a little later on weekends, you can ask. I might say no sometimes, but I won't get angry at you for asking." Sarah looked at him seriously. "What if you get tired of us asking for things?" The question broke Thomas's heart because it revealed so much about what these children had learned from the adults in their lives. They'd learned to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible, to never be a burden. "Sarah," Thomas said, kneeling down so he was at her eye level, "I'm not going to get tired of you, either of you. People who love you don't get tired of you for being children." It was the first time he'd used the word love, and he saw something shift in Sarah's expression. Not quite belief yet, but the beginning of hope. The practical challenges of suddenly being responsible for 2 children were enormous. Thomas had to learn about school schedules, doctor appointments, and the mysterious world of children's clothing sizes. He had to figure out how to braid Sarah's hair for school picture day, how to explain why Danny needed to share his toys, and how to handle the night terrors that both children experienced for the first few weeks. But there were also moments of pure joy that took Thomas completely by surprise. The morning Danny ran to the kitchen to show him a drawing he'd made of all three of them standing in front of the house. The afternoon Sarah asked if she could learn to ride one of the horses. The evening they all sat on the porch watching the sunset, and Sarah said, "I like how quiet it is here. Good quiet, not scary quiet." School presented its own challenges. Sarah was academically behind because she'd missed a lot of school taking care of Danny when Linda was working. Danny had never been in any kind of structured learning environment. Both children were shy around other kids and tended to stick together instead of making new friends. The school counselor, Mrs. DeNemo Patterson, was experienced with children from difficult backgrounds. She worked with Thomas to develop plans to help both children catch up academically while also addressing their emotional needs. Sarah has been functioning as a parent for most of her life, Mrs. Patterson explained. Learning to be a child again is going to take time, and Danny has never had consistent boundaries or routines. He's actually doing remarkably well, all things considered. Thomas threw himself into learning how to be a father with the same determination he'd always applied to ranching. He read books about child psychology, talked to other parents, and asked Maria for advice about everything from packed lunches to discipline strategies. The discipline part was particularly challenging. Both children were so well behaved that Thomas rarely had to correct them, but when he did, they responded as if they expected to be yelled at or punished severely. The first time Danny accidentally broke a glass, he immediately started crying and apologizing over and over, clearly terrified of what would happen next. "Accidents happen," Thomas said gently, cleaning up the glass while Danny watched in amazement. "Let's just be more careful next time, okay?" Danny stared at him. "You're not mad?" "I'm not mad. It's just a glass." We have plenty more. These moments of showing the children that mistakes didn't lead to anger or abandonment happened regularly. Sarah spilled juice on the couch and spent an hour trying to clean it herself, before Thomas found her scrubbing frantically with a wet towel. Danny forgot to feed his pet goldfish for 2 days and confessed tearfully, expecting the fish to be taken away as punishment. Each time, Thomas responded with patience and understanding, and each time, he could see the children relax a little more into the safety of being cared for by someone who wasn't looking for reasons to be disappointed in them. The legal process of adoption moved forward slowly. Linda Hayes followed through on her commitment to terminate her parental rights, but there were still court dates, evaluations, and paperwork. Detective Hernandez kept Thomas updated on Rick Paulson's prosecution, which was proceeding smoothly toward conviction. During this time, Thomas began to understand what people meant when they talked about the unexplainable aspects of how his life had changed. He'd found the children by pure chance if he'd gone to check different fencing that morning, or if he'd left an hour later, or if the storm hadn't blown that blue tarp into the exact position to catch his attention. Sarah and Danny would have died in the desert. But beyond the coincidence of finding them was the deeper mystery of how perfectly they fit into his life. Thomas had always thought his house was the right size for one person. Now, he realized it had been waiting for exactly these two children. Sarah's bedroom got perfect morning light for reading. Danny's room was right next to the kitchen, perfect for a little boy who liked to help with cooking. The big backyard that Thomas had never known what to do with was perfect for children who'd never had space to run and play. Even more remarkable was how naturally Thomas took to being a father. He'd worried he was too old, too set in his ways, too unused to having other people depend on him. But caring for Sarah and Danny felt as natural as any of the ranching skills he'd developed over decades of practice. "It's like you were meant to do this," Maria observed one afternoon as she watched Thomas help Danny build a birdhouse while Sarah practiced her math homework at the kitchen table. "Sometimes it feels that way," Thomas admitted. "Like everything that happened before was just preparing me for this." The children began to change too, in ways that everyone noticed. Sarah started laughing more and worrying less. She made her first friend at school, a girl named Emma, who invited her to a sleepover. Danny began talking in full sentences instead of the few words he'd limited himself to for so long. He started asking questions about everything: why grass was green, where the horses went at night, whether clouds had feelings, but the most significant change was how they began to act like family. Sarah started calling Thomas Thomas instead of Mr. Mitchell, and eventually Dad when she felt comfortable enough. Danny, who had always been reserved with affection, started climbing into Thomas's lap during evening television time. They developed family traditions without anyone planning them. Sunday morning pancakes, evening walks around the property, bedtime stories for Danny, and longer conversations with Sarah about her day at school. One evening in late November, about 2 months after the children had come to live with him, Thomas was cleaning up after dinner when Sarah approached him with a serious expression. "Dad," she said, "can I ask you something important?" "Of course. Are you going to keep us forever?" "Like, really forever? Even when we're grown up?" Thomas stopped what he was doing and sat down at the table with her. "Sarah, I'm going to keep you and Danny for as long as you want me to. Forever, if that's what you want." "Even if we get sick? Even if we're expensive? Even if Danny grows up and wants to do something you don't like?" Thomas realized she was asking about all the reasons adults had given her before for not wanting them around. Even if you get sick, even if you're expensive, even if you make choices I don't understand. That's what families do. They stick together no matter what. Sarah nodded solemnly. "Danny wants to know too, but he's too little to ask the right questions." "What did you tell him?" "I told him, I think we're home now. Real home, not just staying somewhere until something better comes along." "What do you think?" Thomas asked. Sarah smiled, and it was the first completely unguarded, purely happy smile he'd seen from her. "I think we're home too." That night, after both children were asleep, Thomas sat on his porch and reflected on how completely his life had changed. 3 months ago, he'd been a lonely widower, going through the motions of a life that felt increasingly empty. Now he had 2 children depending on him, calling him Dad, and filling his house with the energy and purpose he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The blessing he couldn't explain was becoming clearer. Finding Sarah and Danny hadn't just saved their lives, it had given him a reason to live that was bigger than just getting through each day. They needed him, but more than that, he needed them. He needed their questions, their laughter, their trust, and their love. But Thomas still didn't understand the full extent of what was happening in their lives. The adoption process was nearing completion, and soon he'd officially be Sarah and Danny's father. What he didn't know was that the real miracle wasn't what had already happened. It was what was still coming. The blessing that had begun with finding 2 abandoned children was about to reveal itself in ways that would challenge everything he thought he knew about coincidence, fate, and the mysterious ways that love finds its way into the world. The call came on a Tuesday morning in February, almost 6 months after Thomas had found Sarah and Danny. He was helping Sarah with their science project about horse behavior when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, which usually meant someone trying to sell him something. "Mr. Mitchell? This is Dr. Elizabeth Warren from Austin General Hospital. I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation here that involves you." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Is this about the children? Are Sarah and Danny okay?" "No, sir. They're fine as far as I know. This is about something else entirely. Are you familiar with the name Eleanor Mitchell?" Thomas paused, confused. "That was my wife's name. She died 7 years ago." "Mr. Mitchell, I think you need to come to Austin. There's someone here you need to meet." The drive to Austin took 2.5 hours, and Thomas spent most of it trying to imagine what could possibly involve his deceased wife at a hospital in the city. Maria had agreed to watch Sarah and Danny, asking no questions when Thomas said he had to leave immediately for reasons he couldn't explain. Dr. Warren met him in the hospital lobby. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and the manner of someone used to delivering difficult news. "Mr. Job. Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible," she began as they sat in a quiet corner of the waiting area. "We have a patient here, a young woman named Rebecca Chen. She's been in a coma for 8 months following a car accident. She has no family that we can locate, no identification when she was brought in. Nothing to tell us who she is." Thomas waited, not understanding why this concerned him. "Yesterday she woke up," Dr. Warren continued. "But she has amnesia. She doesn't remember the accident, doesn't remember her life before it. But she remembers one thing very clearly. She keeps asking for Eleanor Mitchell. She says Eleanor told her to find Thomas Mitchell in case anything ever happened to her." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "That's impossible. My wife died 7 years ago. I understand this must be confusing. But Mr. Bow, Mitchell, this young woman knows things about your wife that she couldn't possibly know unless she knew Eleanor personally. She knows that Eleanor liked to make apple pie on Sundays. She knows that Eleanor volunteered at the animal shelter. She knows about the rose garden behind your house." Thomas felt dizzy. None of this made sense. "Who is she? How could she know Eleanor? We were hoping you might be able to tell us that." The walk to Rebecca's hospital room felt like it took forever. Thomas had no idea what to expect, but when Dr. Warren opened the door and he saw the young woman sitting up in bed, Something about her face was familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Rebecca was probably in her early 20s, with dark hair and serious brown eyes that lit up the moment she saw Thomas.
You're Thomas?
She said immediately. Eleanor described you perfectly. Thomas sat down heavily in the chair next to her bed. I don't understand what's happening here. Eleanor saved my life, Rebecca said simply. Not from the accident before that. She found me when I was homeless and sleeping in the park near the animal shelter. I was 17 and had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. Thomas felt the ground shifting under everything he thought he knew about his wife's last years. Eleanor brought me food every day, Rebecca continued. She talked to me about getting my GED, about finding work. She never preached or lectured, just showed up every day with sandwiches and conversation. Eleanor never mentioned you, Thomas said quietly. She said she didn't want to worry you. She said you were dealing with her cancer and didn't need another burden to think about. Rebecca's words brought back memories Thomas had tried to forget. Eleanor's final 2 years had been filled with treatments, doctor appointments, and the gradual acknowledgement that the cancer was going to win. During that time, Eleanor had insisted on maintaining her volunteer work at the animal shelter, even when she was too weak to do much more than sit with the animals. She helped me get my GED, Rebecca said. Found me a place to live, helped me apply for jobs. When she got sicker, she made me promise to take care of myself, to keep going to school, to build a good life. What happened to you after she died? I kept going like she taught me. Finished high school, started college. I was studying nursing, actually. I wanted to help people the way Eleanor helped me. Rebecca's voice grew quiet. The accident happened on my way to clinical rotation. I don't remember anything from that day. But when I woke up yesterday, all I could think about was that Eleanor had made me promise to find you if I ever needed help. Dr. Warren spoke up. Mr. Mitchell, Rebecca has no family, no support system that we can identify. She's going to need extensive physical therapy and rehabilitation. She can't return to school immediately, and she has nowhere to go when she's discharged. Thomas looked at this young woman who had been important to his wife, important enough that Eleanor had kept her existence secret to protect Thomas from worry. He thought about Eleanor's last words to him. Take care of yourself, Thomas, and when the time comes, take care of anyone who needs you. At the time, he'd thought she was just talking about being kind to neighbors and friends. Now he wondered if she'd known something he didn't. Rebecca, Thomas said, would you like to come stay at my ranch while you recover? The offer surprised even him, but it felt right the moment he said it. I couldn't impose like that, Rebecca said. You don't even know me. Eleanor knew you. That's enough for me. Doctor, Warren looked between them. Mr. Mitchell, are you certain about this? Rebecca will need help with physical therapy, follow-up medical appointments, adapting to life after her accident. Thomas thought about Sarah and Danny, about how taking care of people who needed him had given his life more meaning than he'd ever imagined possible. Doctor, I've recently learned that I'm pretty good at taking care of people. And my house is big enough. That evening, Thomas called Janet Coleman, the social worker who had handled Sarah and Danny's case. Janet, I need your advice about something unusual. He explained about Rebecca, about Eleanor, about his offer to help her recover at his ranch. Thomas, Janet said after a long pause, 6 months ago you'd never taken care of children. Now you want to add a young adult with medical needs to your household.
I know it sounds crazy.
It doesn't sound crazy. It sounds like exactly the kind of thing you'd do. But have you thought about how Sarah and Danny will react to having another person in the house? Thomas had been thinking about this during the drive home from Austin.
I think they'll be okay with it.
They're good kids, and they understand what it's like to need help. When he explained the situation to Sarah and Danny that evening, their reaction surprised him. So Eleanor was like your wife, and Rebecca was like her kid, kind of? Sarah asked. Something like that, Thomas said. And now Rebecca needs help, like we needed help? Danny added, that's right. Sarah and Danny looked at each other in that way they had of communicating without words. We should help her, Sarah said firmly. Eleanor would want us to. You never met Eleanor, Thomas pointed out. But you loved her, so we love her too, Danny said, as if this was obvious. 3 weeks later, Rebecca Chen came to live at Thomas Mitchell's ranch. She moved into the guest room on the first floor, which was easier for her while she recovered from her injuries. She was quiet and polite, clearly overwhelmed by the generosity of people she barely knew. But something magical happened as Rebecca settled into their family routine. Sarah, who had always been protective of Danny, extended that protective instinct to Rebecca. She helped her navigate the house with her walking cast, brought her books to read during her recovery, and included her in conversations about school and friends. Danny, who had always been shy around new people, was drawn to Rebecca's gentle manner. She listened to his stories about the ranch animals with the kind of attention that made him feel important. And Rebecca, who had spent years learning to be independent and self-sufficient, slowly allowed herself to accept the care and support of this unexpected family.
"It's like Eleanor is still looking out for all of us," Rebecca said one evening as they all sat on the porch watching the sunset.
Thomas nodded, understanding now what Eleanor had meant about taking care of anyone who needed him. She hadn't just been giving him general advice about kindness. She'd been preparing him for this moment, for these people who would need exactly what he had to offer. The adoption papers for Sarah and Danny were finalized that spring, making Thomas officially their father. Rebecca's recovery progressed well enough that she was able to return to nursing school in the fall, though she continued living at the ranch. But the most remarkable development was how the four of them became a family in ways that had nothing to do with legal documents or official arrangements. They developed traditions together, supported each other through challenges, and created the kind of home where everyone felt safe to be themselves. Dr. Warren, who had delivered Rebecca's medical care throughout her recovery, visited the ranch one day to check on her progress. She found Rebecca playing catch with Danny in the backyard, while Sarah practiced her trumpet on the porch, and Thomas worked on repairing a fence nearby. "This is remarkable, Dr. Pride," Warren told Thomas as they watched the children and Rebecca together. "When Rebecca first woke up asking for you, I thought we were dealing with a medical mystery. Now I think we were witnessing something closer to a miracle." Thomas nodded, finally understanding the full extent of the blessing he'd found impossible to explain. Finding Sarah and Danny hadn't been a random coincidence. Eleanor's connection to Rebecca wasn't a strange accident. All of it was part of something larger, a series of connections that had been building toward this moment, when four people who needed each other would find themselves together, in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. But even as Thomas began to grasp the mysterious way his new family had come together, he still didn't realize that the biggest revelation was yet to come. The blessing that had begun with finding two abandoned children and continued with reconnecting with his late wife's secret protege was about to reveal one final truth that would complete the picture of how love finds its way into the world in the most unexpected ways. The revelation came 18 months after Thomas had first found Sarah and Danny under that blue tarp, during what should have been an ordinary afternoon in late spring. Rebecca had been living with them for over a year. Her recovery was complete, and she was excelling in nursing school while helping Thomas care for the children. They had all become comfortable with their unusual family arrangement. Sarah, now 10, was thriving academically and had developed a passion for horseback riding. Danny, 7, was a different child entirely from the silent, frightened boy Thomas had found. He was curious, talkative, and completely confident in his place in their family. Rebecca, 24 now, had become like an older sister to both children and a daughter to Thomas. The afternoon that changed everything started when Rebecca came home from her clinical rotation at the hospital, carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression that Thomas couldn't read. "Thomas," she said, "I need to show you something, but I want Sarah and Danny here too." They gathered in the living room, the children sensing that something important was about to happen. Rebecca opened the folder and pulled out several photographs. "Today at the hospital, I was going through old patient files for a research project," she began. "I found something that I think explains everything that's happened to us." She handed Thomas the first photograph. It was a medical ID photo of a young woman with familiar eyes. "Thomas, this is Linda Hayes, Sarah and Danny's mother, from when she was admitted to the hospital 3 years ago." Thomas studied the photo, confused about why this mattered. "She was admitted for exhaustion and malnutrition," Rebecca continued. She was working 3 jobs trying to support her children as a single mother. The hospital social worker who handled her case was concerned about her ability to care for herself and her children. Rebecca handed him another document. The social worker who was assigned to Linda's case was Eleanor. The words hit Thomas like lightning. He looked at the document again, seeing his late wife's signature at the bottom of the report. "Eleanor knew Linda?" Thomas asked.
"More than that," Rebecca said gently. "Look at the rest of the file." Thomas read through Eleanor's notes with growing amazement.
His wife had worked with Linda Hayes for over 6 months, helping her apply for assistance programs, find better housing, and access resources for single mothers. Eleanor had even arranged for Sarah to attend an after-school program, and for Danny to get medical care he needed. Eleanor was trying to help Linda build a stable life for her children, Rebecca explained, but Linda was overwhelmed. She was grateful for the help, but she was also struggling with depression and felt like she was failing as a mother. Sarah, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. Eleanor knew us before we ever came here. She knew about you, Rebecca said. She was worried about you. Rebecca pulled out more documents. Eleanor's last note in Linda's file was made just 2 weeks before Eleanor died. She wrote that she was concerned about Linda's relationship with a new boyfriend who didn't seem to care about the children's welfare. Thomas felt dizzy as the pieces began fitting together. Rick Paulson. Eleanor was worried that Linda was making poor choices because she was desperate and exhausted. She recommended continued monitoring and support services, but then... Rebecca's voice trailed off. Then Eleanor got sicker, Thomas finished. And Linda's case got transferred to someone else. Who didn't follow through with Eleanor's recommendations, Rebecca said. Linda lost her support system right when she needed it most. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, trying to process what this meant. Eleanor had known about Sarah and Danny. She'd been trying to help them through helping their mother. When she died, that protection and support disappeared, leaving Linda vulnerable to Rick's manipulation. There's more, Rebecca said quietly. She handed Thomas the final document in the file. It was a handwritten note in Eleanor's distinctive penmanship. Thomas, the note read, if anything happens to me, please know that there are people in this world who need the kind of care you've always given me. Trust your heart to find them, and trust that you'll know what to do when you do. All my love, Eleanor. The note was dated 1 week before Eleanor died. Thomas read it 3 times before he understood what it meant. Eleanor had somehow known that he would need to care for people after she was gone. She'd been preparing him, in her subtle way, for the family he would eventually need to build. But how could she know? Danny asked. How could she know we would need Thomas? Rebecca smiled, and Thomas saw Eleanor's kindness reflected in her expression. I don't think she knew specifically, but I think Eleanor understood that love has a way of connecting people who need each other. She saw Thomas's capacity for caring, and she saw children and young people who needed that kind of care. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before speaking. So Eleanor was looking out for us even before we knew we needed looking out for?
I think so, Rebecca said.
That evening, after the children were in bed, Thomas and Rebecca sat on the porch talking about the revelation. The spring air was warm and filled with the sound of crickets and cattle settling in for the night. Do you think Eleanor somehow orchestrated all of this? Thomas asked. I think Eleanor planted seeds, Rebecca said thoughtfully. She helped me when I needed it, which led me to you when I needed it. She tried to help Linda and the children, and even though that didn't work out the way she hoped, it created a connection that eventually brought them to you too. Thomas thought about the morning he'd found Sarah and Danny. I almost didn't go to that pasture that day. I'd been planning to check the southern fence instead. What made you change your mind? I don't know. Something just told me to go east instead of south. Thomas paused. You know what's strange? Eleanor used to walk in that area sometimes when she was feeling better during her treatment. She said it was peaceful there. Rebecca nodded. Maybe she wanted you to find that peace too. Maybe she knew you'd need it. Over the following weeks, Thomas began to understand the full picture of what had happened to their family. Eleanor's death had created a gap in the support system for several people. Linda Hayes lost an advocate, Rebecca lost a mentor, and Thomas lost his purpose. But somehow, through a series of events that seemed impossible when viewed as coincidences, all of those needs had eventually been met. Thomas had found Sarah and Danny exactly when they needed rescue and exactly when he needed a reason to feel useful again. Rebecca had found her way to them when she needed family, and when they needed someone who understood Eleanor's legacy of caring for others. Even Linda Hayes had found peace in knowing that her children were safe and loved in a way she hadn't been able to provide. The story began to spread through their small community and beyond. Newspapers wrote about the coincidental rescue and the miraculous way the family had come together. Social workers started using their story as an example of how families could form in unexpected ways. Churches invited Thomas to speak about faith and providence. But Thomas always redirected the attention away from the mysterious aspects of their story and toward the practical truth at its center. There were children and young people who needed care, and there were adults with the capacity to provide that care. The miracle wasn't in the coincidences. The miracle was in people choosing to say yes when they encountered someone who needed them. Sarah, now 11, put it best during a school presentation about her family. People always want to know if it was luck or God or magic that brought us together, she said. But I think it was just love. Love doesn't give up on people, even when they don't know they need it yet. Danny, now 8 and completely comfortable speaking in front of groups, added, and sometimes love uses helpers, like Eleanor, to make sure it gets to the right people at the right time. Rebecca, who had graduated from nursing school and taken a job at the local hospital, became a foster parent herself, providing temporary care for children in crisis. She used Eleanor's model of quiet, consistent support to help young people navigate difficult transitions. Thomas, who had never expected to be a father at age 55, discovered that his capacity for love had no limits. He and Rebecca began hosting support groups for adoptive families, sharing their experience with other people, learning to care for children who had come from difficult backgrounds. The ranch, which had once been quiet and orderly, became a place where children laughed and played, where young adults learned life skills, and where people who needed healing could find it. The guest room was rarely empty. There was always someone in transition who needed a safe place to stay while figuring out their next steps. 3 years after finding Sarah and Danny, Thomas stood in his backyard watching his family prepare for Sarah's 13th birthday party. Rebecca was hanging streamers while Danny helped by holding the ladder. Sarah was setting up games for her friends who would arrive soon. Maria Santos joined him, carrying a cake she'd made for the celebration. "You know," Maria said, "when Eleanor was sick, she used to worry about what would happen to you after she was gone. She never said anything to me about it. She wouldn't have. But she asked me to keep an eye on you. Make sure you didn't get too isolated." Maria smiled. "I don't think this is what she had in mind, but I think she'd be proud of what you've built here." Thomas nodded, watching Sarah help Danny reach a high branch to hang decorations. "I used to think I found these children by accident. Now I think we all found each other on purpose, even if we didn't know it at the time." "Eleanor always said that love was the most practical force in the universe," Maria said. "She said it always found a way to do what needed to be done." As Sarah's friends began arriving for the party, filling the ranch with young voices and energy, Thomas understood that the blessing he'd found impossible to explain wasn't really about the mysterious circumstances that had brought his family together. The real blessing was simpler and more profound than that. The blessing was the discovery that a life lived in service to others. Children who needed protection, young people who needed guidance, anyone who needed care, was the most meaningful life possible. Eleanor had lived that truth, had passed it on to Rebecca, and had somehow prepared Thomas to embrace it when his time came. The ranch that had once been too quiet was now full of exactly the right kind of noise. The house that had been too empty was now filled with exactly the right people. The man who had thought his capacity for love had died with his wife had learned that love multiplied rather than diminished when it was shared. Standing there in his backyard, surrounded by the laughter of children and the presence of family he never could have imagined, Thomas Mitchell finally understood the complete truth of the blessing he'd found impossible to explain. It wasn't that he'd been lucky enough to find people who needed him. It was that he'd been wise enough to recognize that needing each other was what made them a family. The story that had begun with 2 abandoned children under a blue tarp had become something much larger. A testament to the way love creates families, protects the vulnerable, and transforms ordinary people into exactly who they need to be when someone needs them. And the most remarkable thing about it was that it was still being written, one day of caring at a time, one act of love at a time, one family at a time.